Hello and welcome to the SecurityMetrics podcast. My name is Jen Stone. I'm the Principal Security Analyst here at SecurityMetrics, and I want to talk to you today about a very important topic. It's third-party risk. We've seen a lot of issues in the news recently. Kaseya, SolarWinds, the list goes on. We all rely on service providers to keep our businesses afloat, and I get asked all the time, how do I make sure that this service provider that's helping me is going to be careful with my data, is not going to negatively affect my business? We know that service providers can elevate our risk while at the same time giving us really important services that we need. But let me tell you about our guest first so that you know kind of his background, where he's coming from, and understand the value he brings to this topic. Paul Poh is managing partner at Radical Security. I'm just going to read a little bit of his bio for you, because memorizing it would be really hard, but it would be cool, but I'm just not that good at this. So Paul has over 25 years of technology and information security experience. Same. You know what? I think we're about the same age, Paul.
Yes, we are.
I think we are, but it's a good age to be. Prior to Radical Security, Paul was Chief Technology Officer for a leading security ratings platform where he led multiple technology teams in building and scaling a platform that could instantaneously rate the cybersecurity posture of any company worldwide. With a background in both large Fortune 500 organizations and small successful startups, Paul was also head of information security and software architecture at the largest separately managed account processor in North America, where he was responsible for the protection of over $1 trillion in assets. He joined the account processor with the acquisition of a small, highly successful provider of advanced wealth management trading tools, where he designed the company's software as a service offering. I think you might already be getting the idea that when it comes to third-party risk, this might have been on Paul's mind a lot through his career. An early innovator, Paul was co-founder for a managed security services provider. He fondly recalls those years where he designed a proprietary client server solution for remote management of an intrusion detection appliance while simultaneously implementing the 24/7 operations plan. As a regular contributor to the third-party community, Paul is a recognized leader in the educational development of third-party risk assessors. He also provides advisory CISO services for several public and private companies. Paul, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me again.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here again, and thanks for inviting me. So looking forward to chatting about third-party risk.
Well, for a lot of the people who listen or watch on YouTube, third-party risk is probably something we've all heard of, but probably bears describing again. Help us understand exactly what it is.
Sure.
Put it in context.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about any business, right? No business builds everything themselves. They use sub-processors. They use other companies. Whether it's hosting your applications on AWS, whether it's using Gmail or G Suite or Office 365, and myriad of other solutions out there. It's your vendors, right? So for most businesses, these vendors introduce risk into their environment.
Right.
If you are a bank, if you are a fintech business, you might have great security, but what about your vendors? Your vendors that also have access to your systems. Your vendors that might be storing and processing information on your behalf. In the third-party risk community, one of the examples that people always talk about is the TJ Maxx credit card breach, right? One of the earliest and biggest credit card breaches, maybe 10 years ago now, right? If you think about it, that credit card breach, helped shape a lot of what we see in PCI today, and also along the lines of why third-party risk is important, right? That breach didn't happen because the stores got breached. That breach happened because a little company called Fazio Mechanical, which probably nobody has ever heard of, was the point of entry into the business, right? Into all the point-of-sale systems,
right?
This was the company that had network connections to every store, and what they did. It was a small mom and pop shop that did monitoring for the HVAC systems in the stores. And, it's kind of one of the reasons why in PCI today you have, this concept of, CDE segregation of your networks.
Right. Yeah. And I think that some of us have learned lessons from that, and some of us have not learned lessons from that. That how we, like you said, segmentation. There are a lot of organizations that don't segment their business side from their operational side, and that's one of the critical things that we've learned from, I think, third-party risk management. But how, before we kind of delve into more examples, how does third-party risk management differ from your internal security risk management?
Sure. I mean, it's really part of your it's really part of how you manage your information security program, right? It's how you manage your risk. It's a component of your risk, because when you sign on a vendor, you are essentially extending your attack surface onto that vendor as well, right? Let's take banks, because we do a lot of business with banks.
Sure.
Most banks don't. Frankly, they don't. They don't run their own bank cores, right? They're not managing their own networks most times. They're not managing their firewalls. They have people, in and out that are, contractors, or, doing things for the bank, right,
Mm-hmm.
as part of the bank. That because they're not in the business of technology, so they hire and they use a lot of third-party vendors. If I was a malicious actor and I was to attack, some hardened system, like a bank,
Mm-hmm.
the easiest way may not be, directly at the bank. It might be through one of their vendors. If you think about, some of the surveys that have occurred, right, like the Ponemon IBM research, breach report,
Mm-hmm.
most, in the last couple of years, when you look at how their companies were breached, about 50% of those breaches occurred because they went through a third party, through a vendor.
And so, kind of sticking a little bit with the financial world, but PCI. So a lot of our listeners are required to follow PCI because they take credit cards, and most of the customers that I work with have at least one service provider, but usually they have a whole host of service providers that you have to list out. And PCI says you need to get an attestation of compliance, or what's affectionately known in the industry as an AOC, from that service provider. I think the intent there is to have some of that risk management done through the instrument of an AOC.
Yeah, and you know what? It's kind of interesting, right? Because today what we see a lot of is when people want to assess how risky it is to do business with a vendor, they ask for audit documents,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the AOC, if they think it's PCI related. The most common one is a SOC 2,
Mm-hmm.
right? At least in the United States.
Right.
Those are great, but it really shouldn't end there. When you're trying to figure out whether if it's risky to do business with a vendor, you have to actually read the SOC 2,
Right.
Not just kind of know that they have one. There are a lot of auditors out there, and the reality is some are more comprehensive than others.
Right.
Some do a better job than others. The other thing about audit reports like SOC 2s is the control environments and what's known as the complementary controls, the complementary user entity controls.
Right.
There's an assumption that you have to have certain controls to for what's audited in SOC 2 to actually apply.
Mm-hmm.
And those kinds of things are really just baselines,
Right.
right? Other things that you have to kind of think about is, your contracts with your vendors. Do you have provisions in there that, protect you, right? Obligations on that vendor that they have a security program, an obligation on the vendor that if they have a data breach, they notify you. Things like, are they doing penetration testing?
Right.
Are they, doing security awareness training? And just the fact that they have a security program and penalties associated with that, right? Because a lot of times smaller businesses that are using, third parties for, data storage of critical data and even processing, they may not have a fully fledged out third-party risk program. So the very minimal thing you can do is have a contract or some security addendum that you ask the vendor to sign.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that I see often is there will be groups that they're trying to get the business of another company. They might be service providers, and they say, all right, they're asking me to prove that we have some kind of a security program in place, or the worst one is, I've been asked to fill out this questionnaire and send it to them to show our security. And I just shudder to think when people fill that out and send it off without even a third-party assistance. When internally, okay, I want to get your business, I want to show you that I'm good, and so I'm going to fill out your questionnaire. What value is in that? I not to be like harsh or anything, but I think it's of limited utility.
It is actually kind of limiting, right? So, and this is one of those debates that happen, within the vendor risk management and the third-party risk community. Our question is good enough. I think it's sort of one, sort of a tool in the toolbox, right? And it's also how you use it. There are actually standardized questionnaires out there. That are actually very good, right? Like the shares, I'm affiliated with the Shared Assessments Group, and they have a questionnaire that's used by a lot of, banks, really. If it was started by banks, but we see it in, utilities, companies, healthcare, insurance, that sort of thing. And really, if you are going to use a questionnaire, you have to understand the answers, right? And you have to kind of look for telltales. A good assessor that's assessing, that's managing third-party risk will be able to pick out sort of the way that a vendor kind of answers that question, right? For example, if you ask them that they don't have if they have a SOC 2, and their response is, we host all our things in AWS, and here's AWS SOC 2.
Right.
That means they don't understand what the question is.
Exactly.
Which means they don't understand, risk management, right? Those are telltales.
Yes.
And I think when you're looking at critical vendors, especially vendors that are processing your customers' data, you really have to kind of understand sort of those answers that you're being asked.
Right.
And you ask for the SOC 2, you have the you have the rights of inspection in your contract, and you might want to invoke that. Now, if you're on the other side, right, if you're a service provider and you're trying to sell to, and you're being asked for this kind of stuff, my advice usually is that you should think of it as almost like a free risk assessment in a way, especially if you're selling to large organizations like the tier 1 banks, right? If you're selling to one of the tier 1 banks, they're not just going to accept your SOC 2. They're going to have their own questionnaire. They're going to have different teams that want to look at their thing. And that sales cycle might take a long time, but that process is almost like getting a free risk assessment.
Right.
And if you think about it that way as a service provider, I'll guarantee you that the buyer is going to be more appreciative, as you being a partner versus some adversary,
right,
which is their security team.
Exactly. And to your point, I think, you talked about signing a contract and taking the time during the sales process, which is the place where I don't see the effort always going in. But once you've signed that contract, you're kind of stuck, right? So making sure, as someone who is going to have third-party vendor relationships and is seeking out a vendor, the time to really iron that out is during that process before you sign something. Right. And I think it's reasonable to have a not just fill out this questionnaire, but a lot of follow-up activities to verify the information. Even if you're a small company, right, if the service provider is working to get your business, then they're going to want to give you good information. And the harder they make it for you, even if you're small, the less likely they're going to actually be a good partner for you once you do sign.
And if you are looking at vendors and you are a regulated entity, for example, if you're in healthcare, if you're a fintech, definitely invoke the fact that you are required by law to do this, right? And reality is that that service provider, especially it's some SaaS business, they're gonna want to get into that segment, because that can be a lucrative segment, right? Healthcare, FinServ, and it just makes them a better service provider. I kind of think of third-party risk as ideally in sort of like the nirvana world. It should be collaborative, right? It should be about protecting that ecosystem where the vendor and the customer are looking to sort of protect the assets or the data assets of the actual end consumer, right? Because at some point there's going to be some end consumer.
Right. And so let's say that you are a company, a small, medium-sized company, and third-party risk management just hasn't really been a big part of what you do, and you're looking to start. What do you recommend for is there a good framework? How do they do this?
Well, I sort of mentioned, I do have an affiliate with Shared Assessments. They're probably they probably have the most mature framework out there, is the way I kind of think of it. And the way you would start is probably with the simple things, right? Which is that, first of all, understand whether if you have, any shadow IT out there, right? Like, is when vendors get onboarded, is it just basically anybody that can do that, with a credit card, right? And you really don't know sort of what your your third party exposure is. Try to corral that first. A good partner to work with is usually your account payables team, right? Because they know, who's being paid. And then, put together sort of a procurement process, right? The first step is to make sure that when new vendors come through and who those vendors are. Easier things to start with is making sure that you have actual, you classify your vendors, right? You want to know, you don't want to spend too much time on the vendor that is, I don't know, sort of watering the plants in the office, right? That's probably not a good, so you want to have classification schemes to figure out how much risk that vendor brings into your business. Right. And then start with simple things like, maybe your tier one vendors, you definitely have to have contracts with them that have some sort of security addendum. Ask them for SOC 2, right? Because if they're B2B, right, they should be used to that question. Right. Those are easy ways to kind of start. Now, if you are a regulated entity, you are required to do things like that. If you are if you're a covered entity under, New York State's Department of Financial Services, for example, your financial service, you have to have a third-party risk program. Right. If you're an insurance company, most state laws require third-party risk programs. And then, of course, HIPAA. And HIPAA, yes. HIPAA's kind of the ubiquitous, right. Like we all can say the word, and it gets thrown around a lot. But covered entities and even business associates know that if they have third parties that could potentially affect the security of protected health information, then they should be doing these things. But it seems daunting for a lot of them. They're not quite sure how to start. They're not quite sure what to ask for. And so in the end, what I see is a lot of them ask for just a business associate agreement. Right. And a business associate agreement is, I think, part of it. It should be maybe the contractual piece that locks in this agreement for data security, but it is not the security program. Yeah. The interesting thing about HIPAA, though, is that the HITECH Act makes the service provider sort of a covered entity as well. Yeah. Right. It makes them so that they're liable and they have to follow all the same rules. Yeah, for sure. In the case of HIPAA, it's a little bit easier, right? Because that service provider has to protect data, and they become sort of a covered entity in the HITECH Act, I believe. With financial services regulations, right, or even utility and other things, the responsibilities on the actual service, on the actual sort of customer, right? The consumer-facing business, right? So a bank doing business with, a core processor or a or even a marketing company that might have access to data, that bank is going to care a lot about third-party risk, because when something bad happens at the vendor, the regulator goes after the bank, right? They're not going to go after the third party. So if you're a service provider, you need to understand that, and you want to be in that industry, you have to understand that that's why banks, fintechs, really will want to put you through the ringer.
Definitely. So as you've kind of worked in the third-party risk space, helping people get there, what are some of the gotchas that you've seen people run into when they're trying to assess third-party risk?
A lot of times it's if you don't already have a third-party risk program, it's things like shadow IT, right? People sort of onboarding vendors without the knowledge of the third-party risk management team. Things like just resource constraints, right? Because it can actually take a lot of time to assess a vendor, right? Because it's kind of like doing a risk. Like if you recall doing a risk assessment yourself, you're basically now doing that risk assessment on, potentially hundreds of vendors.
Right.
So you have to use things to make it a little bit easier, right? Like questionnaires do help, right? There are rating systems, security rating systems out there that will look at the external service of the vendor and understand sort of, how much, have they suffered security breaches? Do we see things about their attack surface publicly that make it look as though they have poor security hygiene, right? Those are very helpful to have and make it very easy to assess a vendor. And then you can also kind of look at the size of that service provider, right? If you're a smaller organization, the larger service providers are not going to be that interested in entertaining your questionnaire.
Right.
But some of those larger organizations already have pre-filled questionnaires that you can just ask for. They may have a cloud assessment information questionnaire as well, right? So you can always ask for that. But you still have to kind of look at it to make sure that if you're looking at their SOC 2, that their expectations of the controls you have and the things that you have to use in their environment are things that you are using.
Right.
Because just because they have a SOC 2 doesn't mean your data is automatically, more secure or not. Right.
So you mentioned a couple of things that make me kind of maybe clue people in on the idea that risk assessment is not just for the IT team. It's not just for the security team. It's not just for the technology group, right? And two of the groups that I think are key in this are your financial group, the accounting group that knows where the money is going, and legal. So we see this a lot in universities where there are a lot of different budgets and a lot of different decision makers. The only way to find out who actually has, for example, PCI scope is to go to Treasury and say, all right, where how the money gets into your various coffers. Where is it coming from? Who set this up? And then that can help find the different data flows just for that specifically. But it's not uncommon also in maybe mid-sized companies, more complex companies, or even companies that are more startups where there has been a less defined process for who's allowed to spend money on what and why.
Yeah. And speaking of startups, especially SaaS businesses, if you're doing business, if you're buying services from a SaaS business, it really is important to kind of do that assessment on that SaaS business. One thing that we've always kind of said and noticed is that SaaS businesses love other SaaS businesses. So you not only have to worry about your third-party risk, but potentially your fourth-party risk, right? If you're obtaining services from some SaaS provider that is using a lot of other third parties because they're a startup and just stitching things together to create that service, you kind of need to know where your data is, right? You kind of need to know, are they, is there any kind of, forwarding of your data sort of outside of, a boundary that you care about, right? These are things you have to kind of ask about.
Another thing that I've seen with some of the groups that I talk to is access controls that allow third parties accessing your system, helping them understand that your contract with them, your agreements with them are not going to protect you from a breach. If there is a connection to their systems, you need to protect, usually by segmentation, by logging, by monitoring, by alerting, by whatever you have control of in your environment to put that additional layer of protection or knowledge of what's happening coming in from their environment, which is not always protected, because the assumption is, oh, well, we have this in place and they have this document that says they're secure, so we're not going to worry about it.
Yeah. And the reason why you do care a lot about that is, if you think about, if I'm a malicious actor and I want to attack, lots of companies potentially, what's better and more sort of cost effective than to go after some service provider that provides services to a lot of companies, right? If you think about, what's been in the news, like SolarWinds and Kaseya, it makes sense. There was probably a few years ago, a lot of attacks against, MSPs, right? If you're a managed service provider and I wanted to spread ransomware to a lot of companies, it's going to be a lot easier to attack an MSP that has access to lots of other companies, right?
Sure.
They may potentially have, admin access to things like domain controllers of different companies, right? Because they're managing their Active Directory. They may have access to, the AWS root accounts, if they're a CISSP. Those are the kind of businesses that typically you would think that is safe to do business with, but you really want to extra care more about how they manage their security, right? If you're going to use their services.
Right. So one of the big topics that always comes up whenever you have something like a SolarWinds or a Kaseya or one of these big third-party service provider breaches, people always start talking about, well, we need regulations. What are your thoughts on that?
I kind of go back and forth about that, right? So, certain regulations can help, but you can't really make it too prescriptive, because most times, they don't really, they just become sort of checkbox kind of things, right? And the problem I have with, regulations is you tend to end up with regulations where you don't want to stifle the economy, so you make it very simple, and then people say, well, I'm complying with the regulation, and there's an assumption that means they're secure, which isn't necessarily true.
Right. Yeah. It's only a starting place, or it's only...
It's just a starting place. Yeah. Compliance is kind of where security starts. It's not where it ends.
And a lot of times I tell people, the way you interpret, and again, it comes down to your assessor, the way you look at a compliance requirement can have a depth of security to it or not. You can look at it in a way that will actually improve the security stance of the organization, or you can kind of skim over the top of it and just check that box. And so that checkbox approach that's not what I do. It always starts with the security, but that's not the experience of all assessors, and people need to be aware of that. So just because you have a piece of paper that says something is compliant doesn't mean that it's compliant. And like you, I've gone back and forth on the question of how do we increase security awareness, understanding, the whole grasping and making it important to some of these people who don't seem to have an incentive to take security seriously.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where that is potentially where regulations do help, right? Because it does kind of create that awareness in some cases. It doesn't have to be, it could be industry-led type of sort of rules, right? Like PCI.
Right.
Even self-regulating organizations, in financial services, like, FINRA, for example, has rules like that. They tend to be geared more towards things like fraud,
right?
But it does kind of sort of encompasses security in a lot of ways.
Right. Well, I know when Sarbanes-Oxley came along and C-levels found out they could actually go to jail, it changed some minds in the industry, but it seems a bit pretty heavy stick though to deal with some of the issues that we're looking at today. Well, I sure appreciate you coming on and talk to me about third-party risk. Do you have any final comments on it before we wrap this up?
I guess, my comment would be, just remember that whenever you onboard a vendor, you're really you're not decreasing your risk, right? You potentially are increasing your risk. I think there's a mindset sometimes that let's just outsource it and not have to worry about it, right? You can't really transfer that risk to that vendor.
Right.
In some cases, you are sort of increasing that risk.
Yeah, agreed. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for joining us on the SecurityMetrics podcast. If you liked what you saw today, remember to like it, subscribe, share it with a friend, and give us comments. Send us an email. We would really like to hear what you have to say about our podcast. I want to make sure that the people that we're having come talk to me are people that are of interest to you as well, and that the topics hit home on something that you're dealing with. Thanks again. Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of SecurityMetrics podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.